Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Adonna Evans with Housing and Community Development, and welcome to the No Place Like Home program, Alternative Process County Designation Requirements webinar. Some housekeeping. We'll have sections throughout the webinar that are open for questions. So if you do have questions, please type them into the chat, and we'll get to as many of those as we can. Everyone is muted on entry, so you can hear us, but we cannot hear you. Any questions that we do not get to, or any questions that you might come up with and don't get a chance to get to us, please email those to nplh@hcd.ca.gov. And I'll start with Christina DeFrancesco presenting the webinar.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining us. The first thing we'll do is just give a brief overview of the program again. So NPL has up to $2 billion in potential funding, $1.8 billion in a competitive allocation, which we're not going to talk about today, approximately $200 million in a non-competitive allocation, which we will talk about today, and $6 million for technical assistance grants. For the alternative process counties, which are counties that have at least 5% of the state's homeless population, sheltered or unsheltered, based on most recent unsheltered point and time count, or 2015, if you've been grandfathered in. If designated as an AP county, developers will apply directly to you and submit project applications directly to you for evaluation. This upcoming round, the counties that are eligible to participate as alternative process counties are Los Angeles, San Diego, San Francisco, and Santa Clara. So you have representatives from each one of those 4 counties on the call today. It's hard to tell from where I'm sitting right now. Again, the population for NPLH units are people who are experiencing chronic homelessness, or are at risk of chronic homelessness. Homeless and homeless definitions are the HUD definitions as of May 1st, 2016, and the at-risk of chronic homeless definition is defined in our guidelines, Section 101. In essence, it's people who are exiting institutions, broadly defined to include such things as jails, prisons, hospital settings, treatment centers, etc., very broadly defined, who, prior to entering the institution, had at least one episode of homelessness in the prior 12 months to entering the institution. So, if you questions on that definition after you read the particular detail in Section 101, you can always call us. But that, in a nutshell, is how at-risk of chronic homelessness is defined. And of course, all of these folks have to have a serious mental illness, defined under the Mental Health Services Act, or be a child or adolescent with a serious emotional disturbance, as defined under the NHSA Act. Is a capital development program that allows counties to access funds for acquisition, new construction, rehabilitation, pre-development costs, and also capitalize operating subsidy reserves. Said a few seconds ago, we have 4 different buckets of funding. The competitive allocation, which we hope to count with our first NOFA in the fall, sometime in mid-October, hopefully. The non-competitive allocation, which we'll talk about today, hopefully that NOFA will go out in mid-August. We're going to talk specifically about shared housing because that is one project type that can be used with non-competitive allocation funds. And you all are alternative eligible alternative process counties. So I'll talk specifically about your responsibilities as an alternative process county, how you get designated as such, and the types of things that you can use the money for, which are different or enhanced differently than, say, if HCD were the lender on those particular loans. When you go through the slides, you'll see citations to our guidelines on each slide, but in general, the provisions that are going to impact alternative process counties are provisions in Article 1, which are general provisions to the whole program, and provisions in Article 3. In some cases in Article 3, it will specifically refer you to a section in Article 2, say, for example, supportive services. But in general, most requirements are going to be contained in Articles 1 and 3. And also separate guidelines for the TA funds. The technical assistance funds at this point, I believe, for all of the eligible alternative process counties, are all the eligible AP counties contract at this point, or do you want to speak to that?
I believe that we are under contract with all of the AP counties. They would either be routing currently or receive documentation to request their distribution of funds. I know that there are at least 2 that I'm aware of that have done so, and 1 that maybe has not submitted a document yet. So we are at some point in the process with all of them.
Moving on specifically to the non-competitive allocation, which will be our first NOFA issued by HCD. Under statute, we can allocate up to $200 million non-competitively to all counties. It's allocated by formula on the homeless point in time count data. So there's a minimum allocation of $500,000 to every county, and then of that, it depends on the county's proportionate share of the statewide homeless, unsheltered, and sheltered PIT. So if you're on our website and pull down the designation form for AP counties, you'll also see that we've posted the non-competitive allocation amounts when running that formula at $200 million, and the AP county amounts are listed in the first 4 lines. So you see there your estimated allocation from that $200 million bucket. There are some particular deadlines that apply to that non-competitive allocation, and that's because funds not awarded to projects by those particular deadlines or not meeting the particular deadlines that we impose in our guidelines will be returned to the competitive allocation. And of course, a portion of that will then go back out to you through that formula, which is slightly different than just PIT. But for this first round, of course, we want you to be able to access as much of your non-competitive allocation as possible and not have any of it returned back into the pot to be run through the formula again. So basically what we're looking at is a 3-stage process for you, or this is how you should think about it. The first stage is to get yourself designated as an alternative process county by filling out the designation forms and submitting that to us by August 26th. It's our intent to get a decision back to you by early October so that we know at that point that you're designated as an AP county, and when the formula for our competitive NOFA, which will be the fall NOFA, we know to take your allocation amounts from that formula and take out of a regional competitive pool, but instead give them to you. So for you, you're on a little faster track than just, say, a county wanting to do shared housing, because you have more of your allocation that is specific to you, other counties in the state. So you'll want to complete that form by August 26th. Secondly, we have to go through a process under statute where you actually accept your non-competitive allocation. So your portion of the $200 million. And pursuant to our guidelines, we need to have you accept that allocation within 12 months of our initial NOFA. So our anticipated release date for the non-competitive allocation NOFA is August 15th. Within 12 months of that, you have to accept your non-competitive allocation so that we are setting it aside for you and it won't return to the competitive pool. And after you accept it, you have to have projects submitted within certain periods of time. So I skip ahead because there's a specific slide that covers this on slide 8. So you can see these deadlines. The one that we just showed was just the deadline for submitting the designation form and getting it back. This one shows you the specific time periods for the competitive allocation. After you get designated, you submit to us an authorizing resolution, then accept your non-competitive allocation, a certification that says you're going to abide by our program rules and your county plan to combat homelessness. Then, with 18 months of our initial NOFA, so somewhere in February, we will award you those funds, and within 30 months, if you're going to use your non-competitive allocation for shared housing, you have to have applications into us for shared housing, those funds, because the non-competitive funds are the only funds that you can use for shared housing. It's supposed to be into us by February of 2021. Within 60 months, you have to have expended all of your non-competitive allocation funds. Again, because this is the non-competitive allocation, we have to at some point pull it back in that other competitive pool and reallocate it out. That's not to say that you won't get a share of that, but we're required to pull it back, and so these are mechanisms we've put in place to pull it back. So you want to pay attention to this, particularly if you're going to do housing, to make sure you get those applications in within 3 months of that initial NOFA, February of 2021, and that you've extended all of your non-competitive allocation within 60 months. So by February of 2023. Because you're an AP county, there's more flexibility in our lines for you than there would be for non-AP counties, in that you can use your non-competitive allocation for 2 basic project types. The first is your basic multifamily rental project or 5 or more units, so your basic apartment complex that HC would see developed and underwritten and all other rental housing development programs here. For those projects, the basic multifamily rental apartment projects, those have a affordability period of 55 years, with at least one member of each household qualifying as an NPLH tenant. Because you are an AP county, you may provide construction period financing with your NPLH allocation. It was a loan underwritten by HCD where we were the lender and held the note and deed of trust and did the monitoring. We're only going to do permanent financing. But you provide construction period financing that converts to permanent financing. In that case, you're going to have to be the perm lender because you have to do the long-term monitoring for 55 years. But can provide the funds up front at construction, pre-development, etc. Whatever is going to work best for the financing of the project. to develop your own underwriting standards, and we'll go through in detail the kinds of issues that the guidelines require you have to cover in those that you tell us about in your designation form. Responsible for monitoring all of the construction or rehab work performed and the long-term monitoring for a minimum of 55 years for these projects. The second base project type is a shared housing project, and this is defined in our guidelines as a 1 to 4 unit structure providing supportive housing shared by 2 or more households with at least one tenant qualifying as an NPLH tenant within the household, where they have their own bedroom, basically, and I'll go through those requirements in a second. Again, for these, you can provide construction period financing. You have to have your own underwriting standards for shared housing. You have monitoring, but the long-term monitoring, the affordability period for shared housing projects is 20 years. So because these projects are smaller and they'll be difficult to finance over a longer period of time, the affordability period we've set for these at only 20 years. So just general kind of outlay before we get into the detail of your responsibilities. And the designation form gets into this in detail, but here's a basic overview. You've got to submit your county plan to combat homelessness, your method of distribution for your project types, shared housing, and multifamily. It's worth noting at this point, if you're going to do both shared housing and regular 5+ unit multifamily projects, I would assume that your underwriting standards for those would be very different. Because the shared housing is going to be much smaller unit size, so we would expect differences in the standards. You have responsibility for selecting projects in accordance with a method of distribution that you develop. You have to underwrite the loans, hold a need of trust as the lender, including holding the project COSER. You do and record the regulatory agreements. You make disbursements to individual projects. We'll respond to you in lump sums, which I'll talk about at the end of the presentation, and then you disperse to individual projects. You're responsible for project long-term monitoring and for coordinating reporting to the department through our annual reporting mechanism. The application process itself, as I discussed a few minutes ago, you have to get the form into us August 27th. The delivery instructions are on the form, and we hope to issue the decisions by early October so that we can do that calculation for the competitive. In the base elements of your designation requirements, I'm going to go into some detail as to what we're expecting. The regulation that governs it in our guidelines that has all of the detail is noted. The one where the regulations are actually in 201. The plan to combat homelessness has to be developed with public input, and I'll talk in a few seconds about who that involves. You can develop a plan by itself that doesn't exist yet, or you could update an existing plan as long as it meets our requirements and is no older than 5 years from the time that you submit it to us. The option of submitting it with your designation form, by end of August, or submitting it when you actually accept your non-competitive allocation from us, so within 12 months of our initial NOFA. Although we've given you 12 months to actually accept that allocation, if you've got projects in the queue and you're ready to go, since you're under a 15-month expenditure deadline, I would encourage you to accept allocation as quickly as possible so that we can start dispersing funds and you can start making awards as soon as possible. But regardless, we've given you until August 15th, 2019 to accept your allocation, and so you have that long of a time if you wanted to actually complete your plan to combat homelessness. The groups that are required to be consulted when you develop your plan are representatives from county behavioral health, public health, criminal justice, and housing, so it's broader than just housing. Your local continuum of care should be consulted. Housing homeless service providers, especially those with experience serving folks who are chronically homeless. Health plans, community clinics, and other health centers, particularly those that have experience using Medi-Cal or other non-MHSA funding to provide or enhance services to NPLH tenants, who are involved in tracking of health outcomes in housing, because we want involvement. We want as much data as we can get on the real-life health outcomes of what we're trying to do here. So getting them up front is important. Public authorities and people who are experiencing chronic homelessness, or who are at risk of chronic homelessness, or the representatives such as family caregivers. To the plan, we want a description of homelessness countywide, including percentages or numbers of homeless, chronic homeless among single adults, families, and unaccompanied youth. This is basic HMIS data that shouldn't be a problem for most of you to pull. We would like estimates of homelessness and chronic homelessness among those experiencing serious mental illness, and covering disabilities or disorders or serious emotional disturbances if it's a child or adolescent. So this basically narrows down to the defined NPLH target population. This may or may not be collected through your HMIS right now, but to the extent that you can estimate that for us, and factor that into your thinking around the types of projects that you want to do and where the need is and how you want to structure services. The point of the planning process is to help you think through these issues, not just for us to get the information. So also a discussion of the special barriers and challenges that you feel that you're going to face with the NPLH target population. I want you to think and tell us about county resources that you have to address homelessness, including any resources that you're putting into efforts to prevent the criminalization of activities that are typically associated with homelessness. This goes to involving criminal justice in the planning efforts. Your available non-county community-based resources to address homelessness. Who partners you're bringing to the table in these efforts, and what are your proposed solutions to reduce and end homelessness? How does NPLH factor into all of that? We want to know about your data collection systems. We have a bunch of required data elements in Section 214 of the guidelines. This is another area where you're going to reference back to Article 2 of the guidelines. Most of the data can be collected through HMIS. Some of it is statutorily required. And then we also have a section of data in 214G, which are things that we would like you to collect if you have the ability to collect them, but are not required. So with respect to 214G, tell us the barriers that you're experiencing in trying to do kind of data collection. For example, collecting before after move-in, the average number of hospital and psychiatric facility admissions and inpatient days, the number of arrests or returns to jail or prison, emergency room visits before and after move-in. These kind of long-term life events and consequences we want to try to collect. We know it's very difficult to access data even from your public health system, and to the extent that we know what barriers you're experiencing at the state level, we might have the ability in the future to help alleviate those barriers, and so we need to know down at the county level, and that's part of the reason we're asking you to discuss that here. So how your CES is going to work, and if you're not going to use a coordinated entry system serving your coordinated entry system that has been set up to serve homeless and chronically homeless, if that's not going to be used to serve the at-risk of chronic homeless population, those that are exiting institutions that may not qualify as homeless because they've been in an institution for longer than 90 days. If you're setting up a separate system to refer those folks to NPLH-assisted units, then we want to know how that's going to work and efforts that you're undertaking to make sure that you can provide all referrals in a non-discriminatory basis. So you know there are particular subgroups within your target population that may not have access to your street outreach or other methods of getting people into your CES or alternate referral system because of language barriers or because of other communication barriers related to disability, for example. What efforts are you undertaking to make sure that you can reach those typically underserved populations? Moving to county experience, there are a few types of experience that we want documented here. The first is program administration experience, and what we're asking you to document is that you've administered at least one local or federally funded affordable housing program in the last 7 years that's funded 4 or more multifamily, that means 5+ unit project loans. Those are loans, at least one of loans has to have PSH units, one or more PSH units. So this would be a bar that most of you can meet. We took a lot of public comment with respect to this particular thing, and I think we have crafted it in a way that addressed all of the concerns that were expressed to us. If you on page 10 of your designation form, I think this is the form that actually requests that information about your program experience. And if you follow, what's requested in the boxes, you should be able to provide with each of the required elements within this experience factor. Second type of experience that we're looking for are providing project-based vouchers or other locally funded rental assistance to homeless or other special needs populations in the last 2 years. We realize that because these folks will have very low or no incomes, that they're going to need rental assistance or other project operating support in order to be able to have them live there feasibly. I want to know what you have made to other projects. You have a history. We can see that you have a history administering project-based vouchers or other types of operating subsidy support for this population. You include commitments made by your city public housing authorities or local housing departments. Say if you've got a flexible housing subsidy pool, for example, as well as your county housing authority. And information we're collecting here is on page 14 of your designation form. For this particular requirement, unlike the general program experience requirement I just discussed, we don't have a minimum number of vouchers we're looking for. We just want to know that you have some experience in the last 2 years. We want to know what your experience has been providing or coordinating the provision of support services to people with serious mental illness who are homeless, chronically homeless, or at risk of chronic homelessness. This chart is on page 15 of the form. We don't have a qualifying number of projects for this. We just want to know what projects you've provided services in or coordinated the provision of services in through subcontracted agencies. Okay. Getting into a little bit more detail around coordinated entry systems. The coordinated entry system definition that we use is primarily, well, in essence, the HUD definition, and that's defined in Section 101, which is the definition section of the regs. In terms of what we're looking for you to discuss about it, that's in Section 300E. We'll want to know how you will prioritize the most vulnerable within the NPLH target population for available assisted units. We know how your participant intake, assessment, and referral process works. How you folks can actually access your system and how it's advertised. Assessment tools that you use to find people or assess people and prioritize people within the CS system. If you're going to use an alternate system for persons at risk of chronic homelessness, as I discussed a few weeks ago, this system as well. For DES systems, they must meet the HUD requirements by the time the county is certified as an alternative process county. And the counties involved here, I'm very shocked if your systems didn't meet the basic HUD requirements. But just note that that's a requirement of our program. And for any alternate system that you set up for persons at risk of chronic homelessness, the system must be in place prior to rent up of your first NPLH-funded project. I'm going to give you more time to put that particular system in place, since this probably will be the first time that you will have had to have established a system for people coming out of institutions. Most counties. Some counties may have already started to do that, but most counties have not. So, okay, I'm going to stop at this point for questions.
Question: to confirm release of non-competitive funds are contingent on passage of AB 827 or favorable outcome in the NPLH litigation, correct?
Yeah, so we're not actually going to release funds until those events occurs, but we're going to get started with the NOFA process that when that means we're ready to go.
When you submit projects, are you referring to the housing development project for which the NPLH non-competitive funds would be used?
The experience requirement or what? I need a little bit more context for the question.
Can you clarify that, Josephine? We'll give you. Yes.
Hi. So I forgot which slide. There was something around use of funds for projects, so I'm not sure if it's possible to go back past slide.
What experience requirement or just general?
Just actually when you referenced projects, I wasn't sure if you were talking about different types of projects like shared housing or what. I think it was under the portion on the responsibilities for the alternative process counties.
Okay, so the type of projects that you can do as an AP county, you are administering the funds yourself and acting as lender, include everything that HCD could do, basically. We're not going to do shared housing, but include regular other multifamily projects that you see HCD do in all of their programs, shared housing. So all the other counties that are not AP counties, other counties, let's say, for example, is an AP county right now. They don't qualify under the formula. So they can only administer their non-competitive allocation for shared housing projects, which are 1 to 4 unit projects. To an AP county, assuming you're coming from an AP county, Justine, you can use that non-competitive allocation for shared housing projects, you can use it for multifamily projects, or you could use it for, you know, one of those exclusively. AP county non-competitive allocations are fairly large comparatively if you look at what everybody else is getting for the LAs. And so we wanted to give counties, the AP counties, the flexibility to use these funds for all project types, not shared housing, so that you could more fully utilize them by the deadlines that we put into place.
Okay, perfect. I think you clarified that it's all project types, and that's what I wanted to confirm. Thank you.
And we'll go over how we will determine how much you get on an annual basis in a few minutes. I think that was another question that came up, so I'll address that then.
Additional questions, and we'll give you time to type it in. Okay, are we allowed to bank, our initial allocation and combine it with the next funding pot?
You can just be aware, if you're going to do shared housing, that you have 30 months to get those applications into you, or we're going to yank back whatever you had designated for shared housing. And you have 60 months to fully expend your non-competitive allocation, or we're going to yank that back. So just be timing. In addition, any funds available from the competitive allocation, the counties have to commit those competitive allocation funds to projects within 24 months of us actually awarding those to you. And that's part of the reason why we're going to award based on your anticipated demand when it comes to those funds in particular. But we're bound by these application submit deadlines and expenditure deadlines, and for competitive allocation, the commitment deadline. So we want to keep all of those in mind. Of course, you want to make sure you actually accept your allocation within 12 months. As long as you're paying attention to the timing, you can do that.
NPLH estimates for the non-competitive program, it estimates $190 million in NPLH remaining distribution. Are those the max competitive funds?
No. The $200 million is the non-competitive pot pursuant to statute. And when HCD takes their admin, it's $190 million competitively, and that's what you see distributed on the allocation sheet that's next to the designation forms. The competitive allocations and amounts, we haven't run that formula yet. The reason for that is because everything that's going on with the litigant and the ballot measure and everything, we're not going to do that until we get ready to issue the NOFA. And based on a different formula that takes into account PID, rent-off burden, I'm forgetting whether poverty's in there or not. I might be thinking of the ESG. PID and cost burden, I believe, are those two formula factors. So it's a different formula than what you see for your non-competitive allocation funds. We'll run that and we'll publish that when we figure out how much is going to be available in that first round of competitive funding.
Optional shared housing designation deadline is the August 27, 2019, the correct date.
Look back at the form to make sure that we've got it correct. Look on the form itself. But we need you to submit your designation form by August 27, 2018. So if you look on page 4 of the form, maybe our slide is wrong, you're submitting your designation form, including for shared housing, within 2 months. I'm going to check slide 2 to make sure that we didn't accidentally put the wrong date in there.
Well, there was a date for the 27th of 2019 as the 12-month date.
The designation form, if you look on slide 12, August 27, 2018. And I'll check the other place where we have it. There's August 27, 2018. There's 2 deadlines that you have to be aware of. The first, remember I said it's a 3-stage process. The first stage, get yourself designated. Submit that form by August 27, 2018, so 2 months from now. That's stage 1. Stage 2, extra non-competitive allocation. That's August 15th of 2019. Pursuant to our guidelines, that's 12 months from our initial NOFA. So we get 12 months to decide whether or not you want to take a competitive allocation. I'm suggesting you use up all that 12 months because you're going to get designated way before then, right? As soon as you get designated shortly thereafter, once we issue our NOFA, you're going to get a little sheet that says, we need ESO from you, and we need you to certify that you're going to use our funds use competitive allocation funds in compliance with our requirements and your plan to combat homelessness. As soon as you can give us those 3 things, then we can officially award your non-competitive allocation funds. But that's stage 2 after you get designated. First, get designated, form within 2 months. Then you accept your allocation, and you can get projects in. All the deadlines on our slides are right. You just have to keep your stages straight. It's a lot of deadlines. So it'll take some time. Be patient with yourselves and call us if you need clarification at any point.
When will each alternative county receive the total amount of funds available from NPLH for our counties? This is important to creating our overall spending plans.
So I understand that it's important for planning purposes. Part of what we need to do here in consultation with the State Controller's Office and CalHAFA that uses the bonds is figure out amongst the funds available in our competitive allocation in particular, so up to 1.8 billion, what flow of projects is likely to be and when they can best maximize selling the bonds to generate the most cash from the bonds. If they sell at the wrong time of the market, it's going to decrease the yield on the bonds and decrease the amount ultimately that we can get out to you. We haven't had discussion with them yet as to exactly how much we want to allocate for that competitive NOFA. I think once we start to have those discussions, we'll have a better sense, especially after the first round of bonds is sold, we'll have a better sense of yield and perhaps a better sense of the forecast of the total $2 billion, how much you're anticipated to get every year. But we allocate you the whole, share your 1.8 up front either, because even small counties for the funds, may be difficult for counties to be able to absorb that, and for you in particular, you're going to have 24 months to commit those funds or they're going to be yanked back. So we want to keep that in mind as well and maximize yield. At this point, for planning purposes for the plan to combat homelessness, roughly based on a $1.8 billion allocation, we can repost this if you want. On our website, we did do an initial run with framing paper, how much each county, the maximum amount each county would get. And we can repost this if you want. You can use that as your not to exceed number if it helps you for planning purposes. It probably, I mean, if interest rates are going up, it might be something less than that.
Forms for shared housing show 2019.
So let me refer you again on the shared housing form. Let me look. That has a different deadline because they don't have any competitive funds that they're allocating. They only have their non-competitive allocation. We need to know earlier from you whether or not you are designated. I'm aware of it. There's a reason for the difference, and explain to you. The reason we need to know from you earlier whether you are an AP county is the amount that we allocate normally in the competitive funding round, which is going out in October. Will come back to you as an AP county. So we need to know by October whether or not you are going to be an AP county. If you are just a shared housing county, all we're looking at is your non-competitive allocation. It's already been calculated. Nobody can mess with that money. It only belongs to you. That's why we're giving those folks until August 27, 2019 to submit their designation form. That's different. You're an AP county. Your money also comes from the competitive allocation. We need your designation form sooner. Yes, there is a different date on the shared housing designation form for counties that are only going to do shared housing. That's why if you are an AP county, you fill out the AP county designation form, not the shared housing. There are also different requirements for the AP county designation than shared housing. The experience requirements are slightly different, and the underwriting requirements are different because you have the option to do multifamily housing, and shared housing does not. That's why the dates are different, but they are all correct as written. All the dates in the AP county for submission of your various documents.
Questions before we move on? Let's proceed to the next section.
Right? Method of distribution. We'll go into a lot of detail on that. That also has to be developed with community input. And again, the groups here are basically the same as those that you would consult when you do your county plan to combat homelessness. Representatives of behavioral health, public health, probation, social services and housing, your continuum of care, housing and homeless service providers with experience serving the target population, health plans, public housing authorities, representatives of family caregivers, or persons living with SMI. So the same core group that you can to develop your plan would also be this group that you can develop your method of distribution, or thereabouts. Same types of groups need to be represented. Relating to a project, we know that your method of distribution will evaluate all the following elements that I'm about to go through the next series of slides. Number one is the eligible uses of funds. We went over that earlier. New construction, rehabilitation, pre-development, acquisition, design, etc. Coaster. You evaluate projects that are multifamily projects or shared housing projects. Those kinds of things you want to be able to evaluate up front. We need to know that you're evaluating development team capacity. So experience of the developer, service provider, property manager to develop, own, and operate permanent supportive housing for the target population. We're not telling you what to set experience bar at. We're giving you that flexibility as a county to set that experience bar in a way that makes sense for the folks that you have in your community doing this work, but we're telling you that you have to look at it as part of your project evaluation process. All of these method of distribution elements are listed on the checklist in your AP County designation form on pages 20 and 21 of the form. It's a full checklist of items that we're asking you to do. If you cover each one of those items on the checklist, you should be in good shape. Third, financial feasibility for the affordable ability period based on your own underwriting standards. We'll go into detail on what needs to go in the underwriting standards, the kind of issues you need to look at, but remember again, affordability period, if you're doing multifamily housing with your AP County funds, will be 55 years. And if you're doing shared housing, that affordability period will be 20 years. So that will probably impact the underwriting standards you put in place for each of those two distinct project types. When you look at financial feasibility, you're going to look at the underwriting standard issues that are covered in Section 304. And rent and occupancy and income requirements in Section 303 and 304. 8 counties do have the option to use the department's uniform multifamily regulations if you wish to do that. If you don't want to develop your own set of multifamily housing underwriting standards, you can use our UMRs. However, from experience in working with projects in a lot of the counties, they'd like flexibility that times the UMRs don't provide it, and so that's why we're giving you the option of developing your own set of uniform multifamily underwriting regulations. I'll go over this a little later on, but just to give you a preview, basically your underwriting standards, you're going to want to look at the reasonableness of your construction and operating expenses. You include escalators. You're going to look at what your vacancy rate assumptions are going to be, debt coverage ratio that you will allow, any operating or replacement reserve requirements, percentage contingencies that you're going to require for construction or rehab projects, it's on development costs and development fees, use of operating cash flow. So everything that we would consider and look at in our own UMRs, you need to look at for yours, but we told you specific levels to set things at. We're giving you that flexibility. In addition, your method of distribution has to include or to look at the suitability of project location, including considering things like the proximity to transportation, services, and other amenities that are going to be needed by the NPLH target population, and in which the project will integrate NPLH tenants into the community, broadly defined. You're going to make sure that all projects are on a permanent foundation and meet applicable building and health and safety codes, including but not limited to minimum square footage requirements and requirements related to maintaining the property in safe and sanitary condition. We haven't specifically excluded tiny homes if you're interested in doing shared housing, but we want to make sure at a minimum that whatever you do will meet square footage requirements and other health and safety requirements that you have locally. Right. It's not funding something that's not up to code, and it'll be your responsibility to make sure those projects meet those requirements. You're going to look at readiness of the project to proceed to construction, particularly since for projects funded through the non-competitive allocation, you have to have all those funds expended within 60 months of our initial NOFA, so February of 2023. And for projects funded out of the competitive, those specifically have a 24-month commitment deadline. So you're always going to want to look at readiness to proceed construction. You're going to look at capital operating and supportive services leverage. We want you to consider leverage because NPLH shouldn't be the only money in the deal. And we're going to want to know how you're going to do environmental assessment for the property. The project must be free from severe adverse environmental conditions, such as the presence of toxic waste that is economically infeasible to remove or can't be mitigated. These are federal funds, so we're not requiring a NEPA environmental assessment. What we do want some environmental assessment that looks at the issues environmentally related to the project, and that would be able to assess based on the project development, but whether or not those issues have been adequately mitigated or can be adequately mitigated or removed. So that's always something that you're going to want to look at when you fund a project, especially if that project has other financing sources that are going to require that as well. Support services. This contains requirements that are applicable to all NPLH projects, so the details actually in section 203 of the guidelines refers you back to section 203. Foremost, the county must make mental health services available to NPLH tenants for a minimum of 20 years and coordinate the provision or referral to other services. There are two categories of services that we require that folks offer to people, and services that we encourage counties or their contracted providers or persons for whom they coordinate referrals make available to people that are not required services but encouraged. Participation in supportive services is voluntary. That's a basic requirement of the program, no matter what the type of service. Services have to be designed to be flexible, individualized, and based on tenant needs, ways that support tenant engagement and housing retention. Our perspective, that's the bottom line to all of this, is you have to design your package in ways that promote housing retention, that are client-driven, based on housing first practices. I'll go into the specific categories of services. Services that are required to be offered to tenants who can use them or not use them on a voluntary basis. Case management, peer support activities, mental health care. The services that we developed in consultation with you, so these shouldn't be any surprise. Some services, support in linking to physical health care, counseling and advocacy, basic housing retention services. Leave this for a few seconds so you can read the detail. Services that may be offered the category of things that we would like the county or others in the community to be able to provide to folks. Our services for people with co-occurring mental and physical disabilities that we haven't already talked about in the required category. Recreational and social activities, educational services, including assessment, GED, assistance in accessing benefits for school, reasonable accommodations in accessing the education process. A lot of people in public comment felt very strongly that we continue to encourage projects to foster the upward mobility of tenants in getting up and out of permanent supportive housing, and one of the ways to do that is to provide access to educational services. And so that's in here as a optionally provided service. Employment services such as supported employment, job readiness, job training, placement, access to volunteer activities for those that are unable to work. And this goes to also tenant engagement, right? If people are engaged in community, engaged in doing activities that are meaningful, they're more likely to stay housed. Obtaining access to other needed basic services such as legal services or access to food and clothing is also important. Engagement and retention strategies also need to be discussed as part of your supportive services plan. And for services that are provided off-site, transportation to those services, you don't necessarily have to provide it as a project, but you have to help people or facilitate access to transportation. And we make sure that whatever is the case, whether it's provided directly by the project or otherwise, that people are walking more than a half a mile to access services, because in our experience, if they are, they generally won't engage in services. And just a general point, these services are required to be provided on-site. If you were not AP County and you were participating in our competitive process, you might get more points if they were, but they're not required to be provided on-site. They can be provided off-site as long as the tenant has reasonable access to those off-site services. We want to make sure that your supportive service plan covers or addresses issues of cultural competency. So how are you going to make sure that services are provided in a way that people of different races, ethnicities, sexual orientations, gender identities, gender expressions, for example, feel they can comfortably access the services and easily access the services. This includes people also with communication barriers related to their disability, as well as language barriers or other types of barriers. And we want you to discuss how the project and how the county is going to facilitate communication among service providers and property managers in a way that promotes tenant engagement and eviction prevention, et cetera. In terms of the integration requirement in particular, we want to know the means by which the projects that you select will be evaluated to make sure that they engage people in community building activities, and architectural design is done in a way that facilitates that based on the scope of the rehab or the construction activity. So all of these things are things that you're going to want to look at when you evaluate the supportive services plan and the project as a whole. You, as the project lender, also have the responsibility for ensuring that the project is compliant with Article 34. Attorneys will not be looking at your Article 34 legal opinion letters, but you have to have a process by which your county attorney does that evaluation and keeps those legal opinion letters on file in the event that Article 34 becomes an issue for you the statute of limitations of those provisions, right? So you want to put yourself there and do that analysis and make sure that you're on comfortable ground with respect to the percentage of units that are being assisted in a project. Continuing on with project integration measures, we want to make sure that the projects, as the lender, are evaluating the property management practices, including ensuring that projects practice low-barrier tenant selection, prioritize those with highest need, and if they're using CES or an alternate system developed with those principles for those at risk of chronic homelessness, that should not be an issue. We want to make sure that the housing first practices under state law now in Welfare and Institutions Code 8255B are being adhered to. You want to look at that carefully when you look at the support service plan and the property management plan, and that eviction prevention and reasonable accommodation policies and practices are in place to facilitate retention of those with the most barriers to housing. Doing scattered site housing or shared housing with multiple structures, want to make sure that the project has common ownership, financing, and property management. Back to shared housing in particular, well, I'll just go over the general issues for tenancy. Each tenant who is not a child accompanied by an adult must have their own lease. This is permanent supportive housing, and have all of the rights and responsibilities of tenancy. They must have a bedroom door with a workable lock. If this is shared housing, they must be allowed to housemates in a manner that does not discriminate based on protected class. And of course, all those have to be NPLH qualified tenants, and each household must have a separate bedroom. Okay, I'm going to stop here for questions.
Any questions? And we'll give you a minute to type in anything that you might want to ask.
Nope.
No questions.
Oh, my.
Okay, move on to the next section.
Okay, I hope that's a good sign. I hope we made it easy to understand. You can always call us later or email the inbox too if you're still cogitating on some of this, and as you get started with your form, questions will come up. So this is, you know, a process where we expect you to communicate with us. These forms aren't evaluated on a competitive basis, et cetera. So we want you to develop the best, most compliant process possible, and we're here to help you through that process as you do that, particularly in the 2 window of time that you're going to have to do this. So, okay, moving on to loan terms. NPLH assistance must be provided in the form of a loan. That's in statute. They must be deferred payment loans to project. That's in guidelines. But if you're an AP county, the loan will be a zero interest loan. If you're an AP county, you can provide construction period financing, whereas for HCD underwritten loans, they won't be, as I said earlier. But financing must convert to perm financing. And as the lender on the project, you must ensure that the loan that you make to the project is secured against the itself, the property and its improvements, and you will have any liens and curses on the property and act as lender as HCD nor would if we were making the loan. occupancy requirements. Incomes for assisted units at initial occupancy must be restricted to 30% of the area median income or below. Anytime that you annually recertify a tenant, their income goes above 30% AMI due to changes in SSI or SSP payment levels, cost of living adjustments, etc. You can continue to charge that household the 30% AMI rent. If the tenant income increases for reasons other than the SSI, SSP payment rate increases, and the tenant can continue to reside in the unit and the project can continue to offer services to the tenant, or the county can continue to offer services to the tenant or contracted service providers. However, the unit will no longer be considered an NPLH designated unit for purposes of meeting your regulatory agreement requirements. We'll go over in a few minutes when you can raise the rents in situations where you've exhausted rental assistance and exhausted transition reserve, but those are the basic income qualification requirements. Underwriting standards must, I mentioned earlier, address the reasonableness of development expenses and operating expenses, including the allowable income expense escalator, vacancy rate, assumption debt coverage ratio, reserve requirements, contingency requirements, limit development costs, and use of operating cash flow. So there's the list of all of the things that you have to think about in developing your underwriting standards. Your requirement also must have methodology for allocating costs between NPLH and non-NPLH units. In particular, if you're going to do multifamily projects, you're going to have some units in the projects, presumably, that are for non-NPLH tenants. So when you're going to have things like an NPLH-funded COSR, that COSR can only support operating deficits attributable to the NPLH units. And so you're going to have methodology for allocating costs between the two unit types. And you also have that in shared housing as well, depending on the size of your shared housing structure and how you wish to finance that. So make sure that you have a cost allocation methodology within your underwriting standards. You have to consider how you're going to evaluate compliance with state prevailing wage, state location requirements, and the handicap accessibility requirements that are going to be applicable to the project, be a state accessibility requirements, ECAC requirements, any local requirements you have, or federal requirements if the project also has federal funds. We are requiring projects to have a transition reserve so that if the project COSR or other operating assistance or rental assistance is exhausted and not renewed prior to the end of the affordability period, that there's a reserve that the project can dip into to prevent rent increases for some period of time on those NPLH units. We are not telling you how you need to set that reserve. That is up to you. We're saying you have to make projects for transition reserve. Exhaustion of your transition reserve will allow you to increase rents on NPLH units, the paid portion of the rent, to no more than 30% of the 50% AMI level. In public comment, we got a lot of public comment around, what if the project is tanking, can we raise rents? So we have created for that. In the that you've exhausted your coaster, your rental assistance is not renewed, other operating support to the project has been exhausted, and your transition reserve has been exhausted. So this is a last-ditch effort to keep project operating and available to the community. We need to do that only to the extent that is necessary for financial feasibility to the project. So if you can raise rents to help some of those NPLH tenants in those units without going all the way up to 50% AMI, that's what we would like you to do. In that vein, if you know you're going to have to raise rents because your transition reserve is going to be exhausted, we want 12 months advance notice of that if projects are in trouble, because we will try to help you avoid that situation if we can. At the very least, we want to know if something in the NPLH portfolio is not doing well. Instead of this transition requirement, we do want you to have a plan. If you know at exhaustion of your transition reserve that will, in essence, necessitate your NPLH tenants move because they won't be able to pay 30% of 50% AMI. So what's going to be your plan for helping those tenants access other available, suitable housing so that they don't end up homeless again? With to the COSER, NPLH will fund a COSER as long as we're also putting development money into the deal, capital money. We won't allow you to fund projects only with COSERs. You have to put some capital money into the deal. COSERs are intended to be used only for the cost of the operating deficit attributable to the NPLH assisted units. The COSER, too, have to be provided in the form of a loan. The statute doesn't make any distinction between COSER and capital in that respect. But again, because you're an AP county, that loan can be a deferred payment loan at zero interest. COSERs only need size for a minimum of 20 years. You can have them longer than that we would encourage that as well. But we've put minimum 20-year on to measure it with the 20-year supportive service requirement. And the per unit COSER amount can exceed the per unit amounts that you establish for your capital side of the funding. That's pursuant to your underwriting standards. So if you're providing $100,000 per unit in capital, you can only provide $100,000 per unit in COSER assistance. Funding a COSER in a project, you must be able to evaluate, or the project must be able to demonstrate to you that they have sought out other rental or operating assistance in lieu of utilizing NPLH funds for a COSER. And the ways that you document that are up to you. We have particular ways that we've written into Article 2 of our guidelines for loans that we underwrite if you want to take a look at that. But I'll leave that up to you to decide how folks document that. The COSER has to be underwritten as well to make sure that you're not overfunding a COSER. There was a lot of concern from some of our state agency partners that too much of NPLH funds would be used for COSER, and so just like we would underwrite the capital side of the loan, the county has to underwrite the COSER side of the loan. You have to establish a maximum percentage of NPLH units that you will assist per project. To take into account the anticipated vacancy rate for a project. If a project is going to have a higher than normal vacancy rate because they're serving mostly chronically homeless people, that will necessitate perhaps that you give them more of a COSER, or if they are going to have a longer rent-up period, or if they're going to have people in the project that are going to be zero income or on DA, You are zero income, even if you're in the unit, that's essentially like having a vacant unit. So all those things you're going to want to consider in deciding how you size a project's COSR, as well as the anticipated operating expenses. Shall hold each project COSR in a segregated interest-bearing account. And you have to establish the disbursement amounts and procedures for the COSR, since you're going to be holding it, based on the results of an independent audit, which will bifurcate the operating deficits of the NPLH units from operating deficits associated with the non-NPLH units. Because again, the COSR that we fund with NPLH should only be assisting the NPLH units. And have to monitor the COSR balances at least once per year to make sure that people aren't spending down too quickly, and if they are, to have discuss a property about ways to avoid that, because you want the COSR to last for a minimum of 20 years. With respect to the operating expenses that are payable from the COSR too, you also have the ability to limit that, in ways that you think sense for you and will keep the project feasible. AD has done that in their COSR underwriting standards in Section 209. So if you want to look at that more when we come out with our application form, you can take a look at that as well, the way we calculate it. But we're giving you the flexibility to determine how you design that, as long as you consider those issues. Okay, on to how we're going to disperse funds to you. We'll disperse funds to you in no more than 2 chunks per year, okay? We don't have to make monthly payments to you or anything like that, like we would on an individual project where we're actually the project lender. We might be able to give you chunks of money based on the amount of money that you'll think you'll be able to draw down based on projects that you have in the pipeline that you're providing financing to. So we want to see a project award letter or other evidence of commitment funds to specific projects, so we know how much you think you're going to need and at a period of time. There's a cash flow analysis. For those of you that are going to be providing construction period financing, you're going to need it a lot sooner than we would on our HCD loans, the only perm loans. Need some kind of certification from you, and we'll develop a form with a disbursement request which says that the project was selected or the projects were selected in compliance with the method of distribution that we approved as part of your designation process. With those 2 draws on an annual basis, we will include an amount that is allowable to be distributed to you for county administration expenses, and that's not to exceed 10% of the amount that we allocate to you annually. In addition to the 10% admin, you can also charge a reasonable and customary monitoring fee. This is actually in a subsequent slide, so you don't have to get it now if you don't want to. I'll do this in a few minutes, but you also have the flexibility to charge a project monitoring fee as long as we see how that monitoring fee is going to be calculated, and we can determine that it's not egregious. In terms of reporting, we will have a project completion report that we will require you to submit to us by June 30th. For each project that's completed by June 30th, we will require it, that project completion report, no later than September 30th of that year. And it may be in some form integrated with the reporting data that you're required to do under Section 213 and HMIS. We haven't to that stage yet. we've did the reporting form itself, but it may be interwoven somehow with the project completion report. We want folks to be able to have a 120-day rent-up period if needed, because these units might take longer to rent up since you're having people from the street. So if submittal of that report would require you to cut short your rent-up period, we can extend that PCR deadline. We'll be developing the PCR form and posting it on our website at some point after we're able to get the NOFAs out. In terms of your long-term monitoring responsibilities, going to that you perform on-site project inspections as you feel is needed during construction or rehab, project completion, and once every 3 years thereafter. So we're not going to tell you you must visit a project every month during construction, but we'll expect that you have some process in place to monitor projects during construction period, project completion, and then ongoing site visits once every 2 years thereafter, and that should coincide with the tax credit schedule. Most of these projects many will be getting tax credits. We'll require that you do an annual review of the project operating budget, audit, or other certified financial statements. This can desk review. It doesn't have to be part of an on-site visit. Annual review of the supportive service plan for the project to make sure that the services offered are still appropriate and they still make sense and are effective for tenants that are there. One of the things that we'll take note of is if a project's not doing well financially, there may be service-related reasons to that. And so if you see that a project's not doing as well financially, that's one flag to you that maybe the supportive services plan needs to be revisited. And as I said before, you may charge a reasonable and customary annual monitoring fee for each project. The fee must be based on the average actual cost of performing monitoring for the NPLH unit, and the basis for determining the amount of the fee must be documented, and the fee must be included in the cost of the project as part of the underwriting analysis. So like we include our monitoring fee in the cost of a project when we do the 20-year cash flow under the UMRs, or now 30-year cash flow. You should factor fee into the cost of the project as well in underwriting projects. Okay. Questions on these level of detail or anything else we've covered thus far? Something down there, Donna.
We are asking for distribution of those attending the webinar today. That's not something we typically do because we're not sure who all of the callers are on today's webinar.
We get a printout of it, but okay.
No questions. We thank you all for attending the Process County webinar today. If you do come up with questions later that you want clarification on, please feel free to email the NPLH email box at nplh@hcd.ca.gov. Thank you very much.